Well, in this video, I'm going to show you the full in-depth tutorial on how you use Nikon for video, and I'm going to walk through how you film videos from auto to manual to all the other video capabilities on this Nikon D5200. So when you first pick up your any Nikon model, this video applies for, it doesn't matter if you have a 7000 line, a 5000 or a 3000 line. This specifically is a Nikon D5200 and this is a beginner's guide. So when you have any Nikon camera, you need to know that this mode dial right here, that is going to be your adjustment dial. That, without pressing any other button, that is going to control your shutter speed or whatever mode that you set it on. But if you set it on manual, that is going to control your shutter speed. So if you want to control your aperture, you want to get out of live view, and then you want to flick that switch down, and then you want to press the exposure plus minus button, and then you can adjust the mode dial. If you want to adjust your ISO, there's a buttons on the side that will say FN. You want to hold FN, and you already know it. You want to adjust the mode dial. The mode dial is essentially the dial that will allow you to control your shutter speed, but on top of whatever other button combination that you will have, and it will let you change things like your shutter speed, your aperture, and ISO. As you can see right here, people often mistake this line or this line or this line, but you see this white little indent? That is wherever you turn the knob, that is going to be the setting that your camera is going to be in. But for the purpose of this tutorial, and specifically we're going to be talking about videos, we're going to be focusing on these four and this fifth one. And these are made, although for photos, I'm going to be talking about it in the realm of video. If you really want to get straight to the point and you don't want to get into the nitty-gritty, Nikon, just like any other camera, this foundation also applies, is you can set it to auto. Once you have the notch lined up, you'll see that your camera itself is set to auto. In other words, the camera itself will automatically adjust the exposure, automatically adjust how the light is, and all you really need to do is just to point your camera, press the red button to record, and that would be it. And as you can see here, if I put my hand in front of the camera, the ISO will jump up, the shutter speed, and if I move my hand away, it will also adjust. Yes, in this situation, it might be ideal, but when you're in situations like you're outdoors or somewhere where it's very exposed, these Nikon cameras tend to not control, in other words, properly. So then your f-stop might go up to all the way up to f22, just so that it can block out the light. And there's certain things where putting your camera in auto is not the best. Anyone will agree with me is that you never want to put, especially video, on auto mode unless you're using a point and shoot camera. So the next mode that we're going to switch your camera into from auto is to P, or in other words, programmed auto mode or flexible auto. From my understanding, when your camera is set to P mode, it is somewhat flexible in terms of, yes, it still automatically adjusts the exposure, but if you turn the knob here on your Nikon camera, you can have a little bit of control in terms of whether or not you want to adjust the exposure or you want to adjust the exposure, make it more brighter or darker in layman's terms. As you can see here, one of the reasons why I stay away, and if you're a total beginner, I highly suggest you shoot manually in manual mode first, although it might seem scary, is that you can see the shutter speed right now. The Nikon camera is set to 1/15, 1/25, and that is on P mode. If I switch back to auto mode, auto also has things like auto white balance mode as well, and ISO auto, and as well as aperture and shutter speed auto. But as you can see here, my ISO will bump all the way up if I put my hand in front of the camera to 3200. In other words, it will get you a very grainy video. And if I press record right now, that is not going to be a good looking video. The only benefit of putting your camera, especially specifically for video, is that you don't have to adjust the settings when you're using anything like, let's say you're using this camera on a gimbal and it automatically adjusts the exposure. But if you're filming anything else on, like, let's say a tripod, or you want to film some kind of cinematic shots, the settings right now that the Nikon camera is set on isn't the best for your best quality, as well as best smoothness and motion blurs to make your footage look the best as this camera can actually offer. So the next three modes, or two modes I would say. First you have your auto mode. This is your programmed auto. This is your shutter priority. This is your aperture priority. And your best friend that you should definitely get acquainted with once you understand the power of this camera is your manual mode. So now that we've gone into auto mode, which essentially lets your camera do whatever the hell that it wants and you have no control, that isn't my favorite mode. This is, I guess, if you really want to take it out of the box and just get the feel for the camera, yes, stick to auto. But eventually you would want to go into P mode. P mode essentially is just the same as auto, but it lets you compensate for the exposure just a tad bit without actually understanding what is going on. So the next mode that we're going to go into is S. So S stands for shutter priority. Shutter priority essentially lets you control the shutter, which is the shutter speed, the one fraction, so it's 1/320 or 1/400, and everything else is controlled by the camera. Now we're shooting on shutter priority. In other words, the dial knob on the right controls your shutter as its primary function, or the shutter speed. But as you can see here, the aperture changes, and once you control, you can also, in shutter priority, you can also control the ISO, which is the artificial lighting. But as you can see, the aperture also changes as well, which is not ideal, especially if you want to film videos. The next mode that you can go into is aperture priority. So what essentially you're letting the camera do is you're letting the camera control the shutter speed and adjust the ISO accordingly while you can adjust the aperture. This is the only time when you're filming on a Nikon camera is where you can actually adjust the aperture in live view, is when you're on aperture priority. But the downside of this is that the shutter speed is usually under 1/30th, which is not recommended for filming video. But instead of when you turn the knob on the right, you're actually adjusting the aperture, or the f-stop, or the depth of field. So if I turn the knob to the right, it goes from f2 all the way up to f22. And aperture priority is good if you want to do like long exposure photography, and that's how you can see that the shutter speed is not even a fraction anymore, it's 30 seconds. In other words, that's how long that the shutter is going to be stayed open for. So that's great for things like night photography, but I primarily focus on video. So aperture priority mode is not something that I use all the time as well, but it's good to know what this mode dial does. And last of course, is you shooting in M, which stands for manual. Manual mode lets you control the shutter speed, the aperture, the ISO, the white balance, and the autofocus. Manual is something that you should be definitely getting used to, and it's not the scariest thing in the world. When I first learned how to pick up this camera, I was stuck on auto until someone pushed me and finally, okay, maybe I guess stick to try manual. And once I used manual mode, I realized what this camera was capable of. And even to this day, I still surprise people that I still use a Nikon D5200 for my videos. So to really maximize all the highest video quality you can for this camera and get your biggest bang for your buck, is that you want to shoot in manual mode and not be afraid of it. Everything is manual. So the knob on the right will control your shutter speed. The only thing that you can't change in full manual is aperture. So then what you need to do is you need to press the plus minus exposure. You'll see your screen light up, and then you want to change the dial. As you scroll the dial, you can go all the way down to have your aperture wide open, whatever that is on your lens. Flick it down, go back into live view, and you can also control by pressing FN and the dial key again to bump up the ISO. And the thing about having your camera on full manual is that you can control exactly how the image or video is going to look in comparison to every other mode that I mentioned, depending on the light. I control the white balance as well, and there's a lot of other things that I can control, which the more control you have in a certain situation, the better it is. So as you can see here, in a most ideal situation, if you have not watched my other full in-depth video guides on how you set your Nikon camera properly, is you want for cinematic videos and get the best bang for your buck, you want to have a shutter speed of 1/50th. And your ISO, you don't want your ISO to go above, I would say 800, and that's where lighting comes in. So in this situation, it is really dark, so I'm just going to turn on my light on the side. Make that have a little dramatic effect. And as you can see, although I'm not going to be recording video directly on the camera, you can see that there's also much better, higher quality video because I have the shutter speed 1/50th, an aperture of 1.8, and an ISO of 320. Actually, I can actually decrease the ISO further to make less noise, and that would be a high quality looking video, guaranteed. In comparison, if I suddenly just turn the camera to, let's say, auto, and I press record, the ISO is set all the way to 2000. I'm shooting at f2.8 aperture and 1/30th, but if I suddenly just take away the light source, my ISO is now at 3200, 1/20th. And the thing about having your camera set on auto exposure is that if the light sources keep changing, that means the exposure in the camera itself is going to change, meaning it's going to give a different depth of field. Your camera might be more grainier, some shots not grainier, and that's the overall downside of relying on automatic mode. That is why I recommend shooting on a manual mode, as it's not as scary as you may think it is, because once you understand how to properly expose your camera by doing it yourself, you actually understand the camera, and that is the foundations of video. Doesn't matter if you use a small camera to a big $5,000 camera, cameras rely on these same type of foundations. Shutter speed might be shutter angle, but it's still controlling how fast something is moving. So 1/50th is going to be exactly a motion blurred cinematic shutter speed that you want. The f-stop 1.8 is going to be constant. It's going to be the depth of field. And ISO is the artificial lighting within the camera, and that's the setting that you want to have the lowest, so then there's less grain in your camera. You can press info, and once you press that info button, there's going to be different displays on your Nikon LCD, and there is a light meter or exposure meter built within, and it will tell you a rough estimate of whether or not your image or video is going to be a little overexposed or underexposed. Now that I pressed info, I can scroll through the different display screens on the LCD, but the thing about shooting completely on manual mode is that it will show you the exposure meter on your camera, and you can see that it's this little bar right here. And if you ever wondered what is that on your camera, some cameras might tell you plus or minus 1. It essentially is the meter, so wherever your focus is. As you can see right now, the negative means that the image or point of focus is underexposed, and if it's at the plus, that means it's overexposed. Depending on where that little line is, if it's all the way, chances are you're 3 stops or more underexposed, and if it's all the way up, chances are you're 3 stops or higher overexposed. But if I move the point of focus onto my subject, you can see that I am almost, according to the camera, within proper exposure. When you shoot video, you want it to be not overexposed, but it's better to be a tad underexposed. But in the most optimal place, you would want your subject to be in the exact middle where it says 0. As you can see here, if let's say I change the shutter speed to 1/40, that line meter is straight in the middle, 1/30, and I raise the ISO up, you can see that my image, I just look at the image and I see that it's overexposed. But if you're not used to the camera yet, you can just press info. You can see this little bar right here, and it's telling you that your image itself is overexposed. So what do you do? In my situation, I would say that, oh, my shutter speed is not 1/50th, so I can control that. Oh, the ISO is at 1000. I can lower that all the way down until I get the proper exposure for my picture or video. And you can also change the aperture. And it's essentially a combination of those three, of how you control light and how you control what the camera reads, and to produce your end quality video result. And that was an overall super basic beginner entry-level tutorial guide walkthrough on all the Nikon modes, but this applies for the foundation of any camera. If you want to get into video, I highly suggest that you get into manual mode and start from there and learn. It's about trial and error and constant learning. I'm always learning. And that is how I film videos on my Nikon. My name is Peter. You're watching Broke Visionary Collective. We all start with nothing, but you can always create something.